Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. The first time it happened, Mira thought it was a fluke, a trick of light and shadow, or perhaps her tired eyes playing tricks after hours at the easel. She had been working on a still life for her advanced composition class. A simple arrangement of bottles, a ceramic bowl, and a draped cloth. But instead of focusing on the objects themselves, she had become fascinated with the spaces between them, the negative shapes created by the absence of objects rather than their presence. Professor Whitaker had introduced the concept the previous week. Negative space is just as important as positive space, he'd explained, moving around the classroom with his characteristic energy. Most beginning artists only see the objects. Advanced artists see the shapes between the objects, the negative spaces that define boundaries and create balance. The assignment was straightforward. Create a composition focusing primarily on negative space. Mira had taken to it immediately, finding something liberating about painting absence rather than presence. She had worked late into the night in the empty studio, the campus quiet around her. When she finally stepped back to assess her progress, she noticed something odd in the dark triangle formed between two bottles and the edge of the canvas. A face, not clearly defined, but unmistakably face-like. Two dark spots suggesting eyes, a vertical shadow implying a nose, a horizontal line that could be a mouth. She hadn't painted it intentionally. It had simply emerged from the interplay of shapes and shadows. Pareidolia, she murmured to herself, naming the psychological phenomenon where humans perceive patterns, especially faces, in random stimuli. The same mechanism that made people see the man in the moon or Jesus on toast. Nothing unusual. She packed up her supplies and left the face as it was. It added an interesting element to the composition, a little Easter egg for anyone looking closely enough to find it. When she presented the painting in class the following week, Professor Whitaker praised her understanding of negative space. During critique, another student raised his hand. "There's a face in that dark area between the bottles," he said, pointing. "I see it too," another student chimed in. "And there's another one, in the shadow beneath the bowl." Mira looked where the second student was pointing. She hadn't noticed that face before, but now it was obvious. A more defined visage than the first, with hollowed eyes that seemed to stare directly at the viewer. Interesting use of pareidolia. Professor Whitaker nodded approvingly. Our brains are wired to find faces, especially in ambiguous visual information. Mira has cleverly exploited that tendency. "I didn't actually paint those intentionally," Mira admitted. "They just appeared in the process." Professor Whitaker's eyebrows rose slightly. "Even more interesting. Your subconscious at work, perhaps. The best art often emerges from places we don't consciously access." After class, he held her back. "You have a natural affinity for this technique," he said, studying her painting with intensity. "Have you considered developing it further?" "Perhaps. As the focus for your senior project, Mira hadn't, but the idea took root immediately. The accidental faces fascinated her. How had her hand created something her conscious mind hadn't intended? "I'd like that," she said. "Working with negative space feels right somehow." Professor Whitaker nodded, still looking at the painting, rather than at her. "Just be careful," he added, his tone shifting slightly. "Sometimes when we stare too long into empty spaces, we start to see things that perhaps aren't meant to be seen." Mira laughed, assuming he was joking. "I'll try not to summon any demons through my still lifes." He didn't laugh in return. Art history is full of painters who became obsessed with what exists between objects rather than the objects themselves. Not all of them maintained their equilibrium. He finally looked at her, his expression serious. "Just keep your feet on the ground, Mira." She nodded, slightly unsettled by his intensity, but too intrigued by the new direction to be deterred. Over the next few weeks, Mira produced a series of paintings focused exclusively on negative space. She worked with various arrangements, architectural spaces, natural settings, human figures, always emphasizing the shapes between and around rather than the objects themselves. And in every painting, faces emerged, sometimes subtle, sometimes startlingly clear. Never intentionally painted, yet undeniably present once the work was complete. Her classmates began to comment on the creepy vibe of her work. Professor Whitaker watched her progress with a mixture of approval and concern. "You're developing a distinctive style," he told her after reviewing her latest piece. A painting of a crowded cafe where the spaces between patrons revealed a complex network of watching eyes and partial faces. "But I wonder if you're becoming too fixated on these emergent figures." "They're fascinating," Mira defended. "I never know what's going to appear. It's like the painting creates itself." "That's precisely what concerns me," he replied. "Art should be guided by the artist's intention, not the other way around." But Mira couldn't stop. The faces in her paintings had become more defined, more varied. Some appeared serene, others disturbed or disturbing. Some seemed to watch the viewer, others to watch the human figures within the paintings themselves. Each one emerged organically from her brushwork, unplanned, yet inevitable. The turning point came one evening in her apartment. Mira had been staring at her latest unfinished canvas, trying to decide how to develop the negative space between a chair and a window. As she concentrated, her gaze drifted to the actual corner of her room, the dark, triangular space between her bookshelf and the wall. Something moved there, not physically, not in a way that disturbed the air or made sound. More like a shift in perception, as if the darkness had folded in on itself momentarily. Mira blinked, and for an instant, she saw it clearly. A face in the corner, watching her. The same kind of face that appeared in her paintings, not fully human, not fully formed, existing in the in-between spaces of reality. She jerked back, knocking over her palette. By the time she looked again, the corner was just a corner, empty shadow between solid objects. "I'm working too hard," she muttered, pressing her palms against her eyes. "Need to sleep more." But in the following days, she began noticing similar phenomena in other negative spaces. The gap between buildings visible from her bedroom window, the space beneath her desk, the area between hanging clothes in her closet. Momentary glimpses of faces and figures, always in her peripheral vision, always gone when she tried to look directly. She told no one, afraid they would think she was hallucinating or having some kind of breakdown. Instead, she channeled the experiences into her work, painting with increasing fervor. The faces in her art became more numerous, more detailed, more alive. Her senior project exhibition was scheduled for December, and by November, she had produced enough work to fill the Yassau small gallery space allocated to her. Professor Whitaker helped her select and arrange the pieces, his concern now evident in every interaction. "These are powerful works, Mira," he said as they hung the final painting. Her largest and most complex piece, where the negative spaces between a crowd of concert-goers revealed an intricate pattern of watching entities. "But I'm worried about you. You look exhausted." She was exhausted. Sleep had become difficult, her apartment now seeming full of watching presences in every shadow, every corner, every space between objects. She had taken to sleeping with lights on, though it didn't help. The entities existed in negative space, not in darkness. Light only created more defined shadows, more places for them to manifest. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just working hard to finish everything." Professor Whitaker studied her face. "There's something I should have shared with you earlier," he said finally. "When I saw your first negative space painting, I recognized something familiar, a particular quality I've seen before." He gestured to a bench, and they both sat. "Before I taught here, I studied art history with a focus on artists who reported unusual perceptual experiences. There's a subset of painters throughout history who became obsessed with negative space and began seeing entities within it." Mira's heart pounded. "What kind of entities?" "They described them differently, some as angels, some as demons, some as beings from other dimensions. The terminology changed with the cultural context, but the experience was consistent. Figures that existed in the spaces between objects visible only peripherally or through artistic representation. That's... Mira swallowed hard. That sounds like schizophrenia or some other mental illness. Perhaps, he acknowledged. That's certainly the modern explanation, but these artists weren't otherwise impaired. They functioned normally except for this specific perception. And their art. He looked around at her paintings. Their art had a particular quality, a way of revealing what exists in negative space that most people never notice. Like mine, Mira whispered. He nodded. Like yours, which is why I should have warned you more explicitly. These perceptions tend to intensify with focus. The more you paint negative space, the more you see in it. I'm seeing them, Mira admitted, relief flooding through her at finally saying it aloud. Not just in my paintings, in real spaces, corners, gaps, the spaces between things. They're watching me. Professor Whitaker didn't look surprised. I was afraid of that. It's the pattern these cases typically follow. The question is whether you're revealing something that's actually there or creating it through perception. Does it matter? Mira asked. Either way, they're real to me now. It matters, he said gravely, because of what happened to those other artists. Some managed to step back, to stop focusing on negative space, to paint other subjects. Their perceptions eventually normalized. Others became increasingly obsessed, their work becoming more complex, more revealing. And those artists? What happened to them? Mira pressed when he hesitated. They disappeared, he said simply. Some were found later, apparently having died by suicide, though the circumstances were often strange. Others were never found at all, as if they had somehow crossed over into whatever they were perceiving. Mira looked around the gallery at her work. Dozens of paintings filled with watching faces and partial figures all emerged from the negative spaces she had so carefully rendered. You think my paintings are dangerous? I think they might be inviting something in, he said carefully. These historical cases suggest a pattern. First, the artist perceives these entities in negative space, then represents them in art, which somehow strengthens their presence or their connection to our reality. Like opening a door, Mira murmured. Exactly, like that. And the more you paint them, the wider that door opens. The exhibition opening was scheduled for the following evening. Mira spent a restless night in her apartment, acutely aware of the watching presences in every corner, every shadow. They no longer hid from her direct gaze. They remained visible, becoming more substantial with each passing hour. In the space between her bed and the wall, a tall, thin figure stood watching. In the corner of her ceiling, a cluster of smaller entities gathered. In the gap between her closet doors, something with too many eyes blinked slowly. None moved toward her. None seemed overtly threatening. They simply watched, as they had been watching from her paintings all along. By morning, Mira had made her decision. She arrived at the gallery 2 hours before the exhibition opening, carrying a large canvas bag. Professor Whitaker was already there, making final adjustments to the lighting. I need to take down my work, she said without preamble. He turned, studying her face. You've seen more of them. They're everywhere now, watching, waiting. She began removing the nearest painting from the wall. I need to destroy these. All of them. Professor Whitaker didn't try to stop her. Are you sure that's the solution? These entities, whatever they are, existed before you painted them. You just perceived what was already there. No. Mira shook her head, carefully placing the painting face down on the floor. I didn't just perceive them. I invited them. Every brushstroke was an invitation, every finished piece a doorway. She looked up at him. You were right to warn me. Art isn't just representation, it's creation. I've been creating connections. To whatever these things are. Together, they removed all 23 paintings from the walls. Mira had brought canvas cutting tools, and methodically she began destroying each work. slashing through the carefully rendered negative spaces where faces and figures lurked. As she cut through each canvas, she felt a subtle shift in the air around her, as if pressure was being released. The watching presences that had followed her to the gallery seemed to recede slightly with each painting destroyed. Professor Whitaker helped silently, gathering the ruined canvases into trash bags. When they finished, Mira felt lighter than she had in weeks, though not entirely free. "They're still there," she said, glancing at the corner of the gallery where several entities remained, watching with what she now interpreted as frustration, but fainter, more distant. "The connection is weakened," Professor Whitaker nodded, "but not broken entirely. You'll need to stop painting negative space completely. Focus on solid objects, defined forms. Ground yourself in the physical rather than the spaces between." "What do I tell everyone about the exhibition?" He considered this. Health issues, a personal crisis. It doesn't matter. What matters is closing the door you've inadvertently opened. In the weeks that followed, Mira did exactly that. She switched to landscape painting, focusing on solid mountains, definite trees, tangible clouds. She rearranged her apartment to eliminate ambiguous spaces, pushing furniture against walls, removing items that created complex shadows. Gradually, the entities receded from her perception. They never disappeared entirely. She would always glimpse them occasionally in her peripheral vision, always sense their presence in empty corners and shadowed recesses. But they no longer dominated her awareness, no longer seemed to be watching with such focused intent. For her final senior project, she presented a series of hyper-realistic still lifes, fruits, flowers, everyday objects painted with meticulous attention to their physical presence rather than the spaces between them. Professor Whitaker approved the new direction without comment on the abrupt change of subject matter. At her graduation, he pulled her aside. "Have they gone?" he asked. Quietly. "Mostly," she replied. "I still see them sometimes, but they're fainter, more distant. As long as I don't focus on them, they seem to lose interest in me." He nodded. "That's typically how it resolves, when it resolves well. The perception never disappears completely once activated, but it can be managed." "Were you ever—" Mira hesitated, then asked the question she'd wondered for months. "Did you ever see them yourself?" Professor Whitaker smiled faintly. "Why do you think I recognized what was happening to you so quickly? I had my own experience with negative space in my younger years. Fortunately, I had a mentor who recognized the signs and guided me away from that particular abyss." "As you did for me," Mira said gratefully. "As I tried to do," he corrected. "Though I should have been more direct from the beginning. Your talent made me curious to see how far you would go, which was irresponsible of me." Mira thought of the destroyed paintings, the entities they had revealed, the doorways they had nearly opened. "Do you think they're really there, objectively existing in some way? Or are they just projections of our minds?" Professor Whitaker considered the question seriously. "I think the distinction may be meaningless. Perception shapes reality. If we perceive something consistently enough with enough focus and intention, perhaps we give it a kind of existence. Like art itself," Mira suggested. "Creating something from nothing." "Exactly like that. Which is why art has always been considered powerful, even dangerous in some contexts. It's not just representation, it's manifestation." As they parted ways, Mira glanced at the space between two buildings across the campus quad. For an instant, she saw a familiar watching presence, one of the entities that had appeared most frequently in her destroyed paintings. It seemed to nod to her before fading from view. She turned away deliberately, focusing instead on the solid forms of trees and buildings around her. Whatever existed in negative space would continue to exist, with or without her attention. The key was understanding that attention itself was a kind of invitation, and some invitations were better left unextended. In her subsequent career as an illustrator, Mira developed a style known for its bold, definite forms and minimal negative space. Critics sometimes commented on the grounded solidity of her work, its emphatic physicality. None of them noticed the single small area of negative space she included in each illustration. A tiny acknowledgement of what existed between and beyond the physical world. Not an invitation, but a recognition. Not a door opened, but a respectful nod through a firmly closed window. After all, negative space was real as the objects that defined it. The trick was remembering which side of that boundary humans were meant to inhabit, and which entities were best left to their own dimensional interstices, watching but not invited in. I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm a software engineer, for crying out loud. I deal with logic and code all day long. But what's been happening in my new house has no logical explanation, and it's getting harder to deny. It started about 3 weeks after I moved in. I got this place for a steal, honestly. 4-bedroom Victorian on the edge of town, way below market value. The real estate agent mentioned something about the previous owner having to sell quickly, but I didn't ask questions. Who would, right? The first night it happened, I woke up around 3 a.m. with that weird feeling someone was watching me. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? I opened my eyes and nearly had a heart attack. There was a figure just standing at the foot of my bed. It was dark, like a shadow, but somehow darker than the darkness around it. No features I could make out, just a human-shaped silhouette. I couldn't move. My whole body felt heavy, like someone had placed weights on my chest and limbs. After what felt like forever, I managed to reach for the lamp. When light flooded the room, there was nothing there, just my empty bedroom. I wrote it off as sleep paralysis. I'd read about it before, that sensation of being awake but unable to move, often accompanied by hallucinations. Stress from the new environment, my brain playing tricks. That's what I told myself. The second night it happened, I was prepared. I'd left a small light on in the corner of the room, but it made no difference. I still woke up at almost exactly the same time, and the figure was there again, standing silently, watching. This time, when I finally broke free of that paralysis and sat up, it didn't immediately disappear. It lingered for a moment, then seemed to fade into the shadows of my room. By the 5th night, I was getting desperate for sleep. I decided to let Rusty, my golden retriever, sleep in the bedroom with me. Dogs are supposed to be sensitive to that kind of thing, right? If nothing was really there, Rusty would just sleep through the night. Bad call. Around 3 a.m. I was jolted, awake by Rusty's growling. He was standing at the foot of the bed, hackles raised, staring at something I couldn't see yet. Then I felt that familiar heaviness settle over me, and the figure appeared, right where Rusty was looking. The dog went ballistic, barking, snarling, but also whimpering like he was terrified. He wouldn't approach the figure, just kept his distance while making all the noise he could. The shadow remained perfectly still, unfazed by the commotion. When I finally managed to turn on the light, Rusty was still agitated, sniffing around the spot where the figure had been standing. That's when I noticed the carpet. There were indentations in the thick pile, like someone had been standing there. Actual physical evidence. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, or much of the next day. I started researching the house, digging into its history. The real estate agent wasn't very forthcoming when I called, just repeated that the previous owner had to sell unexpectedly. But a quick search online gave me what I needed. Dr. Elliot Chambers. That was the previous owner. He was some kind of sleep researcher who worked independently after leaving his university position. According to the local newspaper archives, he disappeared about 8 months ago. Just vanished. His sister eventually had him declared legally absent so she could sell the house. I took a day off work and went to the county records office. Found out Dr. Chambers had lived here for almost 15 years. Neighbors described him as reclusive, always working on some kind of research. No one had seen him for days before his car was found abandoned at a local park. When I got home that evening, I decided to do a more thorough exploration of the house. There were still boxes I hadn't unpacked, areas I hadn't properly examined. The attic was at the top of my list. It was mostly empty except for some old furniture and a locked trunk pushed against the far wall. The lock was flimsy, and I managed to break it open with a screwdriver. Inside were journals, dozens of them spanning years, all in the same precise handwriting. I brought them downstairs and started reading. At first, it was pretty standard research stuff: sleep cycles, dream patterns, consciousness studies. But about 5 years ago, the entries took a different turn. Dr. Chambers had become obsessed with something he called consciousness projection. The idea that with enough training, a person could separate their awareness from their physical body during sleep. His notes got increasingly erratic. He described experiments he was conducting on himself, using a combination of meditation techniques, sleep deprivation, and some kind of drug regimen. He claimed to be making progress, documenting how he could observe himself sleeping and eventually move around the house while his body remained in bed. The final journal ended abruptly. The last entry, dated just days before his disappearance, read, "Success at last. Full separation achieved for over 3 hours. Reintegration becoming difficult. Physical form feels foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. The freedom of projection is addictive. Why return to the limitations of flesh? Perhaps I won't next time." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed with all the lights on, Rusty beside me waiting. At exactly 3:07 a.m., I checked the clock. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. Rusty whined and pressed against me. The figure appeared, not at the foot of the bed this time, but next to my dresser. It stood there for a moment, then moved, actually moved, toward the bed. It had never done that before. I found my voice somehow. "Dr. Chambers?" I said. The figure stopped. The room got even colder. "I know who you are," I continued, my voice shaking. "I found your journals. I know what happened to you." The shadow seemed to shift, becoming more solid, more defined. I could almost make out features now. The suggestion of a face, shoulders, arms. "This is still your house, isn't it? You never left. You just projected yourself out of your body and couldn't. Get back!" The figure moved closer to the bed. Rusty was trembling beside me, but he'd stopped growling. "Where is your body?" I asked. It was a question that had been bothering me since reading the journals. If Dr. Chambers had separated his consciousness from his physical form, what happened to his actual body? The shadow raised an arm, pointing toward the floor. The basement? Then it moved to the edge of the bed and sat down. I felt the mattress dip under an invisible weight. The cold was intense now, radiating from where the figure sat. I forced myself to stay put, to not run screaming from the room. "You want your life back," I whispered. "That's why you're here every night. You're trying to reclaim what was yours." The shadow nodded, actually nodded, and reached toward me. I felt a pressure on my chest, like a hand pressing against my heart. A deep drowsiness washed over me, my eyelids suddenly heavy. I fought to stay awake, realizing with horror what was happening. He wasn't just trying to reclaim his house, he wanted a body again. Mine. I rolled away, falling off the bed, dragging Rusty with me. The shadow figure stood looming over us. I scrambled backward until I hit the wall. "This is my house now," I said, trying to sound firm despite my terror. "My life. You had yours." The figure remained still for a long moment, then slowly faded until it was gone. The room gradually warmed up. I've packed a bag. Rusty and I are staying at a hotel tonight. Tomorrow I'm calling a real estate agent. But first, I need to check the basement. I need to know if I'm right about what's down there. Because if I am, if what remains of Dr. Chambers is still in this house, I don't think he's going to let me leave so easily. And I can't shake the feeling that next time I close my eyes, I might wake up as nothing more than a shadow at the foot of someone else's bed. I never wanted the night shift. No one does, really. But as the newest nurse at Mercy Regional, I didn't have much choice. 3 nights a week, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., I'd walk the quiet corridors of the hospital's East Wing, tending to patients while the rest of the world slept. There's something different about a hospital at night. During the day, it's all controlled chaos. Doctors making rounds, visitors coming and going, tests being run, decisions being made. But at night, everything slows down. The fluorescent lights seem harsher against the darkness outside. Sounds echo differently through the empty hallways, and the line between life and death feels somehow thinner. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been a registered nurse for 5 years. Mercy Regional was my 3rd hospital position, but my first experience with regular night shifts. The East Wing housed primarily geriatric patients and those with chronic conditions, not the high-intensity cases that went to the ICU, but people who were nonetheless seriously ill, many approaching the end of life. We were chronically understaffed. On nights, sometimes with just 2 nurses and a nursing assistant for the entire 20-bed wing. Hospital administration cited budget constraints, but we all knew the truth. They simply couldn't find enough people willing to work those hours. I first saw the shadow figure during my 2nd week. I was doing a medication round at around 2 a.m., moving from room to room with my cart. As I exited room 412, movement at the far end of the corridor caught my eye. A dark silhouette turning the corner, moving with purpose. Hello? I called thinking it might be Dr. Reeves, the on-call physician who occasionally checked on patients during the night. No response. I wheeled my cart to the nurse's station where Elena, the other night nurse, was updating charts. Did you see someone walk by just now? I asked. Down toward the south corridor? Elena glanced up, dark circles prominent under her eyes. No one's supposed to be here except us and Marcus. Marcus was our nursing assistant, currently helping a patient in room 405. I saw someone, I insisted. A figure turning the corner. Elena shrugged. Probably one of the residents. They sometimes come through on their way to the cafeteria. I accepted this explanation, though it didn't quite fit what I'd seen. The figure had moved with confidence, like someone who knew exactly where they were going, not like a tired resident looking for coffee. 3 nights later, I saw it again. This time I was at the medication room when movement reflected in the glass cabinet caught my attention. I turned to see a dark figure walking past the open door, heading toward the patient rooms. I stepped into the hallway quickly. Excuse me? Can I help you? The corridor was empty. I walked its length, checking each intersection, each doorway. Nothing. Whoever, or whatever I had seen had vanished. When I mentioned it to Elena later, she gave me a strange look. You saw the shadow doctor, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The what? She glanced around, though there was no one else at the nurse's station. It's just something the night staff talks about. A figure that walks the halls, always. Just out of clear sight. Always at night. A ghost story? I said skeptically. Really? Elena shrugged. I've been on nights for 3 years. I've seen things I can't explain. Most of the long-timers have. Have you seen this shadow doctor? Twice, she admitted. Both times right before a patient coded. That's part of the story. It appears before unexpected deaths. I rolled my eyes. That's just confirmation bias. Patients in this wing die regularly. If you see a shadow occasionally, of course some deaths will happen around the same time. Maybe, Elena conceded. But ask Marcus about Mrs. Abernathy in room 417 last month. He saw the shadow enter her room at 3 a.m. She was stable, recovering from pneumonia, scheduled for discharge the next day. By 3:30, she was gone. Massive pulmonary embolism out of nowhere. I didn't pursue the conversation further, attributing it to the kind of supernatural thinking that often develops among night shift workers in high-stress environments. Hospitals have always been breeding grounds for ghost stories and urban legends. The shadow doctor was just Mercy Regional's version. But a week later, I had my 3rd encounter, and this one was harder to dismiss. I was checking on Mr. Geller in room 408, an elderly man recovering from heart surgery. His vitals were stable and he was sleeping peacefully. As I adjusted his IV, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing in the doorway, observing. I turned quickly, expecting to see Marcus or Elena. The doorway was empty, but I had the distinct impression that someone had stepped aside just as I looked up. I moved to the door and looked out into the hallway. 20 feet away, a tall, dark silhouette was walking away from me, moving with that same purposeful stride I'd noticed before. "Hey," I called out, louder than I'd intended. The figure didn't stop or turn. It continued to the intersection, then disappeared around the corner. I followed quickly, reaching the corner in seconds, only to find an empty corridor. There was nowhere the figure could have gone. The hallway stretched for 50 feet with no doorways except for the supply closet, which was locked at night. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had been too solid for a shadow, too defined for a trick of the light. It had moved like a person, like a doctor making rounds, checking on patients. When I returned to Mr. Geller's room to finish my assessment, I found his heart rate had become slightly irregular. Nothing alarming, but a change from the steady rhythm he'd maintained since surgery. I made a note in his chart and continued my rounds, pushing the shadow sighting to the back of my mind. At 4:17 a.m., Mr. Geller's monitor alarm blared. By the time I reached his room, he was in full cardiac arrest. We called a code and began resuscitation efforts, but despite everything we did, we couldn't bring him back. He was pronounced dead at 4:43 a.m. The cardiologist who reviewed the case the next day was puzzled. The surgery had been successful, Mr. Geller's recovery textbook. There had been no indications of complications, no warning signs, except for that slight irregularity I'd noted after seeing the shadow figure in his doorway. I didn't mention the shadow in my report, but I couldn't stop thinking about Elena's words. It appears before unexpected deaths. Over the next month, I saw the figure 3 more times. Each sighting was followed within hours by a patient's unexpected deterioration. Not always death. One patient suffered a stroke but survived. Another developed sudden sepsis but responded to antibiotics. But always a significant, unpredicted change in condition. I began documenting these incidents privately, noting the time and location of each sighting and the corresponding patient events. A pattern emerged. The shadow appeared most often between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., what medical professionals sometimes call the witching hours, when the human body is at its lowest ebb and hospital deaths peak. I also noticed it appeared more frequently, in rooms at the end of the corridor, farthest from the nurses' station. Rooms where patients received checks less often during the night due to our limited staffing. One night, after a particularly difficult shift involving 2 deaths, both preceded by shadow sightings, I found myself in the hospital cafeteria with Marcus. At 7:30 a.m., the space was filling with day shift workers grabbing coffee and breakfast, their energy a stark contrast to our end-of-shift exhaustion. "You've been seeing it, haven't you?" Marcus asked quietly, stirring his coffee. "The shadow," I hesitated, then nodded. "Elena mentioned you saw it before Mrs. Abernathy died." Marcus's expression darkened. "Not just her. I've been on nights for 7 years. I've seen it maybe a dozen times, always before something happens." "What do you think it is?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. A month ago, I would have dismissed the whole thing as superstition. "Some say it's death itself making rounds," Marcus said. "Others think it's the ghost of a doctor who used to work here. Me? I think it's something in between." "What do you mean?" He leaned forward. "You know how some animals can sense when a tsunami is coming or when an earthquake is about to hit? They detect changes we can't perceive. What if some part of us, some energy or consciousness, can sense when death is approaching? What if that's what we're seeing?" I considered this. "But why would it take the form of a doctor?" "Because we're in a hospital," he said simply. "Our minds interpret this perception through the lens of our environment." It was an interesting theory, more grounded than ghost stories, but still firmly in the realm of the supernatural. I wasn't ready to accept that yet. There had to be a rational explanation. "Has anyone ever tried to research this?" I asked. "Documented the sighting systematically?" Marcus shook his head. "Who would believe us? Besides, most nurses who see it either request a transfer to day shift or convince themselves they imagined." "But you've stayed on nights." He was quiet for a moment. My mother died of cancer when I was a teenager. The night before, she told me she saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. At the time, I thought it was the morphine. Now I wonder if it was the same thing we see here, some manifestation of the approach of death. If that's true, I said slowly, then the shadow isn't causing these deaths and complications, it's just aware of them before they happen. That's what I believe. Marcus nodded. It's an observer, not a cause. That conversation marked a turning point for me. Instead of trying to dismiss or rationalize the shadow sightings, I began to approach them as a phenomenon worthy of investigation. If the shadow doctor appeared before unexpected patient deterioration, perhaps it could serve as an early warning system, a way to identify patients who needed closer monitoring. I started a more detailed documentation project, creating a private log of every sighting complete with location, time, and subsequent patient events. I also began researching Mercy Regional's history, looking for any past incidents or figures that might connect to what we were experiencing. The hospital's records were digitized only back to the early 2000s. For earlier history, I had to visit the hospital's small archive room in the basement, a space filled with filing cabinets and bound volumes that smelled of dust and old paper. The archivist, a retired nurse named Judith who volunteered 3 days a week, was surprised by my interest. Most young nurses don't care about the hospital's history, she said, helping me navigate the filing system. What exactly are you looking for? I hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. I'm interested in any unusual occurrences in the East Wing, particularly involving unexpected patient deaths or staff experiences that might be considered unexplained. Judith gave me a knowing look. You've seen the shadow doctor, haven't you? My surprise must have been evident because she chuckled softly. Don't look so shocked. That story has been circulating since before I started here in the 1970s. You know about it? I asked, amazed that this phenomenon had apparently been observed for decades. Of course, every hospital has its ghost stories. Mercy's happens to be about a dark figure that walks the halls at night. She pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet. But unlike most hospital legends, this one has a documented origin. The folder contained newspaper clippings, internal memos, and what appeared to be excerpts from an investigation report, all dating from 1953 to 1954. The name Dr. Edward Thorne appeared throughout the documents. Dr. Thorne was a physician here. From 1948 to 1953, Judith explained. He worked primarily with terminal patients, developing what he called transition care, essentially an early version of palliative medicine. But he became obsessed with the moment of death itself. The documents revealed a disturbing progression. What had begun as legitimate research into improving end-of-life care had evolved into something much darker. Dr. Thorne had begun spending his nights at the hospital, ostensibly checking on his patients, but actually documenting their deaths in minute detail. A memo from the hospital administrator expressed concern about Thorne's increasing presence during night shifts and reports from nursing staff about his unusual behavior and disturbing statements regarding his research. Most alarming was an internal investigation report from October 1953, which indicated that several patients under Thorne's care had died unexpectedly. While no direct evidence of wrongdoing was found, the pattern was concerning enough that the hospital had planned to terminate his position. Before they could act, however, Dr. Thorne was found dead in his office, an apparent suicide by drug overdose. A newspaper clipping described how he had been discovered by a night nurse who noticed his office light on during her rounds. The article mentioned a journal found with the body, containing what authorities described as disturbing writings about death and the transition between worlds. The official story was that he killed himself rather than face dismissal and potential investigation, Judith said. But there were rumors that his research had taken a supernatural turn, that he believed he could somehow perceive or even communicate with death itself. And the shadow sightings began after he died? I asked. According to hospital lore, yes. Night staff began reporting glimpses of a tall, dark figure walking the halls, particularly in the wing where Thorne had conducted most of his research, what's now the East Wing. I left the archives with photocopies of the key documents, my mind Racing. The shadow doctor wasn't just a contemporary phenomenon. It had been observed for over 70 years, always in the same pattern, always with the same association with unexpected patient deterioration. Was it possible that Dr. Thorne had, somehow remained in the hospital after death, continuing his research into the transition between life and death? Or was Marcus right? Was the shadow not Thorne himself, but some manifestation of approaching death that he had been studying, now visible to those who worked the same night shifts he had once haunted? That night, I approached my shift with a new perspective. If the shadow doctor appeared before unexpected patient events, perhaps its appearances could be used to prevent negative outcomes. I resolved to act immediately if I saw the figure, increasing monitoring and assessment of any patient it seemed to visit. Around 3 a.m., I was at the nurse's station updating charts when I felt a sudden chill. Looking up, I saw the now familiar silhouette at the far end of the corridor, standing motionless. As I watched, it turned and entered room 421, where Mrs. Patel, a 78-year-old woman recovering from pneumonia, was sleeping, instead of simply documenting the sighting. I immediately went to check on Mrs. Patel. Her vital signs were stable, her oxygen saturation normal. Nothing seemed amiss. But remembering the pattern, I increased the frequency of her monitoring, checking her every 15 minutes instead of every hour. At 4:10 a.m., I noticed a slight drop in her oxygen saturation, from 98% to 94%. Not alarming in itself, but a change. I adjusted her oxygen flow and continued monitoring. By 4:30, the saturation had dropped to 89%, and she was showing signs of respiratory distress. I called the on-call physician immediately. By the time Dr. Reeves arrived, Mrs. Patel was in acute respiratory failure. X-rays revealed she had developed a pleural effusion, fluid around her lungs, that hadn't been present on her scan the previous day. With prompt intervention, thoracentesis, to remove the fluid and adjusted antibiotics, Mrs. Patel stabilized. Dr. Reeves commended my attentiveness, noting that without early detection, the outcome could have been much worse. "What made you check on her so frequently?" he asked. "Her condition yesterday didn't suggest any risk of complication." I hesitated, then gave a partial truth. "Just a feeling. Something didn't seem right." Over the next 2 weeks, I had 3 more similar experiences. Shadow sightings followed by increased monitoring that led to early intervention for developing complications. In each case, the patient survived what might have been a fatal event if caught later. I began to view the shadow doctor not as something sinister, but as an ally, an early warning system that, if heeded, could save lives. I shared my approach with Elena and Marcus, who adopted similar protocols. When any of us saw the shadow enter a patient's room, we immediately increased monitoring and assessment. Our unofficial system seemed to be working. The East Wing's mortality rate for night shifts began to decrease, though the shadow appearances continued. We were using the phenomenon to our advantage, turning a ghost story into a practical tool for patient care. Then came the night that changed everything. I was doing a medication round when I saw the shadow doctor more clearly than ever before. It wasn't just a silhouette this time. I could make out the suggestion of features, the shape of a lab coat, the outline of a stethoscope around its neck. It moved with purpose toward room 415, where Mr. Jimenez, a relatively stable patient, recovering from gallbladder surgery, was sleeping. I followed immediately, entering the room less than 30 seconds after the shadow. Mr. Jimenez appeared to be sleeping peacefully, his vital signs normal on the monitor. I checked his surgical site. No signs of infection or bleeding. His IV was flowing properly, his medication regimen appropriate. For the next 2 hours, I checked on him every 15 minutes. Nothing changed. His condition remained stable. By 6 a.m., as my shift neared its end, I began to wonder if I had finally witnessed a false alarm, a shadow appearance not followed by patient deterioration. Perhaps our intervention system was working so well that we were preventing the very events the shadow seemed to predict. I was completing my final check on Mr. Jimenez before shift change when he opened his eyes and looked past me toward the corner of the room. His expression changed to one of recognition, almost welcome. "You're back," he said clearly, though I was the only other person in the room. "Mr. Jimenez?" I said, turning to look where his gaze was directed. The corner was empty. "The doctor in the shadows," Mr. Jimenez continued, his voice surprisingly strong. "He's been visiting me, telling me it's almost time." A chill ran down my spine. "Time for what, Mr. Jimenez?" He smiled serenely. "To go, of course. He says it won't hurt, that he studied the transition carefully." Before I could respond, the monitor alarm sounded. Mr. Jimenez's heart rate was dropping rapidly. I called a code, and within seconds the room filled with the emergency response team. Despite our immediate intervention, Mr. Jimenez went into cardiac arrest. After 20 minutes of resuscitation efforts, he was pronounced dead at 6:37 a.m. The autopsy revealed a massive pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled to his lungs, causing sudden death. There had been no warning signs, no way to predict or prevent it, even with our increased monitoring. But Mr. Jimenez had seen the shadow doctor, had spoken to it, had received some kind of communication about his impending death. This changed everything. The shadow wasn't just appearing before deaths, it was somehow interacting with patients, at least those who were approaching death. And it had identified itself, through Mr. Jimenez's words, as the doctor in the shadows, who had studied the transition carefully, Dr. Edward Thorne. That morning, instead of going home after my shift, I returned to the hospital archives. Judith wasn't there, but she had given me permission to access the records independently. I pulled every document related to Dr. Thorne, searching for anything that might explain what we were experiencing. In a box of personal effects that had never been claimed by family, I found a small leather journal, Thorne's research diary from the months leading up to his death. The entries documented his growing obsession with the moment of transition between life and death. "There is a pattern to how death approaches," he wrote in one entry. "A thinning of the veil that can be perceived, if one knows what to look for. I have begun to see it. A darkening around certain patients hours before any physical signs of deterioration. It is as if death casts a shadow before it arrives." In later entries, his writings became more disturbing. "I have begun to follow it, the shadow of approaching death. It moves through the corridors at night, visiting those whose time is near. By observing its patterns, I can predict with increasing accuracy which patients will experience sudden decline." The final entries suggested Thorne had moved from observation to intervention. If the shadow can predict death, can it also be used to study the exact moment of transition? I have begun timing my presence to coincide with its appearances. The patients report seeing a figure in their rooms before the end, not the shadow itself, but me, standing in the darkness, observing. Am I becoming death's proxy? Its assistant, in the transition. The last entry, dated the day of his suicide, was the most chilling. I understand now. The shadow is not death itself, but the thinning of the boundary between worlds. Those who are about to cross over can perceive this thinning. And those of us who spend our lives at this boundary, doctors, nurses, those who work with the dying, can sometimes glimpse it too. I have spent so long studying this threshold that I have become attuned to it, able to perceive it clearly. But perception is not enough. I must experience the transition myself to truly understand it. Tonight I will cross the threshold, but I will not leave my work behind. I will continue my observations from the other side, walking the corridors, between worlds, studying the moment of transition from both perspectives. Death's researcher working in the shadows. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Dr. Thorne hadn't simply died. He had deliberately crossed over, intending to continue his research from the other side. And for over 70 years, that's exactly what he appeared to have been doing. Walking the corridors of Mercy Regional as the shadow doctor, observing patients as they approached death. But there was something else. Something that connected to our recent experiences. Thorne had written about death casting a shadow before it arrives, and a thinning of the boundary between worlds that could be perceived by those attuned to it. This aligned with what Marcus had suggested. that the shadow wasn't causing deaths but perceiving them before they happened. And we had been using those perceptions, those appearances to intervene, successfully in some cases, but not all. Mr. Jimenez's death suggested there were some transitions that couldn't be prevented, no matter how early we detected the warning signs. I left the archives with a new understanding of what we were experiencing. The Shadow Doctor, the lingering presence of Edward Thorne, wasn't an enemy or a harbinger of doom. He was a researcher, continuing his life's work from beyond death, studying the transition between worlds and perhaps inadvertently providing us with warnings that allowed us to save those who could be saved. That night I gathered Elena and Marcus in the break room before our shift began and shared what I had discovered. I showed them photocopies of Thorne's journal entries and explained my theory about what the Shadow Doctor represented. "So we've been working with a ghost," Elena said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Using a dead doctor's research to prevent deaths. Not prevent all deaths," I clarified. "Just those that can be prevented with early intervention. Mr. Jimenez's pulmonary embolism was sudden and massive. Nothing we could have done would have saved him, even with warning. That's why some patients die despite our increased monitoring." Marcus nodded. "The shadow appears before all significant transitions, but only some can be altered." "Exactly," I said. "And I think there's something else going on. Mr. Jimenez saw the Shadow Doctor, actually saw and communicated with him. Thorne wrote about patients seeing a figure in their rooms before the end. I think those who are close to crossing over can perceive him more clearly than we can." "So what do we do with this information?" Elena asked. "Tell hospital administration we're working with the ghost of a doctor who committed suicide 70 years ago." We all knew that wasn't an option. Instead, we agreed to continue our unofficial protocol, responding to shadow sightings with increased monitoring, while also paying closer attention to what patients themselves reported seeing or experiencing, before decline. Over the next several months, our approach evolved. We documented not just our own shadow sightings, but also patient reports of night visitors or doctors they didn't recognize. We found that patients who reported such visits were indeed more likely to experience sudden deterioration, but with our early interventions, many survived what might otherwise have been fatal events. We also began to notice patterns in which events could be prevented and which couldn't. Respiratory complications, infections, and certain cardiac events often responded to early intervention. Massive strokes, pulmonary embolisms, and aortic ruptures almost never did, no matter how quickly we responded. It was as if some deaths were fixed points, immutable, while others were more flexible, dependent on circumstances that could be altered. The Shadow Doctor appeared before both types, but our interventions only affected the latter. I found myself developing an unusual relationship with the phenomenon. I no longer feared seeing the shadow in the corridors. Instead, I watched for it, grateful for the warnings it provided. Sometimes, when I was alone at the nurse's station in the quietest hours of the night, I would speak aloud to the empty hallway. "Thank you, Dr. Thorne," I would say softly. "We're continuing your research. We're learning from your observations." I never received a response, of course, but occasionally, after such one-sided conversations, I would find that the shadow appearances became more distinct, more easily perceived, as if our acknowledgement somehow strengthened the connection between worlds. One night, nearly a year after I first saw the Shadow Doctor, I was checking on Mrs. Winters, an elderly patient with advanced heart failure who had been declining steadily for days. Her family had been notified that the end was near, but they lived out of state and wouldn't arrive until morning. As I adjusted her oxygen, I noticed her eyes tracking something in the corner of the room. Following her gaze, I saw the Shadow Doctor more clearly than ever before. A tall figure in a white coat, features indistinct but recognizably human, watching with what seemed like professional interest. "You see him too?" Mrs. Winters said, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he's been here a long time, studying the transition. He told me," she said. "He's been explaining what's happening. That my heart is too weak to continue, but that the crossing over won't hurt." She paused, her breathing labored. He said some of you can see him, the ones who work at night, who pay attention to the shadows. I took her hand. Does it comfort you, knowing someone has studied this transition so carefully? She smiled faintly. It does. He says it's his life's work, understanding the threshold between worlds, and that sometimes when the timing is right and the person is ready, he helps guide them across. I stayed with Mrs. Winters for the remainder of my shift. The shadow doctor remained in the corner, a silent observer to our conversation and her gradual decline. Just before dawn, she passed peacefully, her hand still in mine. As the first light of morning filtered through the window, I looked to the corner where the shadow had stood. It was gone, its purpose fulfilled, at least for this transition. In the years since, I've continued to work the night shift at Mercy Regional. The shadow doctor still walks our corridors, still appears before significant transitions, still provides warnings that allow us to save those who can be saved. I've come to see our hospital as existing at a unique intersection, a place where the boundary between worlds is particularly thin, where life and death engage in their eternal dance under the watchful eye of a researcher who refused to let death end his studies. Sometimes new night nurses report seeing a strange figure in the hallways. I listen to their accounts with understanding, then gently explain our unofficial protocol. Most adapt quickly, coming to view the shadow doctor as we do, not as something to fear, but as a colleague of sorts, working from the other side of the threshold to help us navigate the complex territory between life and death. Hospital corridors exist in a liminal space, neither fully of the living world nor fully of what lies beyond. They are pathways of transition, from illness to health, from health to illness, from life to death. It seems fitting that in such spaces, the boundaries between worlds might blur, allowing those who pay attention to glimpse what normally remains unseen. Dr. Edward Thorne understood this. In his obsession with the moment of transition, he found a way to position himself permanently at the threshold, continuing his observations from both sides. His shadow walks our corridors still, a testament to the power of human curiosity and the thin veil that separates our world from whatever lies beyond. And we, the night nurses of Mercy Regional, walk with him, learning from his 70 years of research, using his observations to save those who can be saved, and providing comfort to those whose time has come to cross the threshold he studies with such dedication. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the hospital sleeps and the boundaries between worlds grow thin, we acknowledge his presence and continue his work, not with fear, but with professional respect for a colleague who refused to let death end his research, who found a way to turn the hospital corridors into his eternal laboratory, studying the greatest transition of all from both sides of the threshold. The call about Grandma Eliza's death came on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was standing in front of her isolated Victorian home in rural Maine, key in hand, and a strange sense of foreboding settling over me like the afternoon fog rolling in from the coast. I hadn't seen my grandmother in nearly a decade, not since that uncomfortable Christmas when she'd cornered me in the kitchen, her eyes wild with urgency, insisting I remember 3 rules if I ever stayed in her house. Never sleep in the east bedroom, never remove the mirrors from the hallways, and always keep a light on at night. I'd dismissed it as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman, perhaps early dementia. Now, as the sole beneficiary of her estate, my mother having passed years earlier, I found myself the reluctant owner of a house I'd only visited a handful of times as a child. The lawyer had handed me an envelope along with the key. "Your grandmother was quite insistent that you receive this privately," he'd said. Inside was a handwritten letter in Grandma Eliza's elegant script. "My dearest Caroline, if you're reading this, I've passed on, and the house is now yours. I pray you'll heed the warnings I've given over the years, though I know how they must sound to modern ears. The rules are not superstition, but necessity. Never sleep in the east bedroom. Never remove the mirrors from the hallways. Always keep a light on at night. There is a darkness in our family line, Caroline. It has followed us for generations. The journals in my study explain everything. Read them before you spend a night in this house. With all my love and deepest concern, Grandma Eliza, I folded the letter with a sigh. Clearly, whatever paranoia had gripped her that Christmas had only intensified with age. The house was exactly as I remembered, grand but faded, like an aging starlet clinging to former glory. Dust covers draped the furniture, and the air smelled of mothballs and old books. The hallways were lined with mirrors of various sizes and styles, some antique, others seemingly placed haphazardly, as if function mattered more than aesthetics. Spent the afternoon removing dust covers and opening windows to air out the musty rooms. By evening, I'd made the master bedroom habitable and ordered takeout from the only restaurant in the nearby town that delivered to such a remote location. As I ate my mediocre pizza in the kitchen, I contemplated Grandma's letter. The east bedroom was easy enough to avoid. It was small and uninviting anyway. The mirrors seemed harmless if oddly placed, and keeping a light on, well, I'd always preferred a nightlight anyway. But curiosity about the journals nagged at me. I found my way to her study, a cozy room lined with bookshelves. On the desk sat a row of leather-bound journals, dated and arranged chronologically, the earliest from 1897. The first journal belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Harriet Blackwood. Her elegant handwriting detailed the beginning of what she called our family's burden, April 17th, 1897. I fear what Thomas has done cannot be undone. His obsession with the occult has brought something into our home, into our very bloodline. The shadow figures came first in his dreams, then in his waking hours. Now they watch me too. Thomas says they are travelers from a place beyond our understanding, and he has made a pact with them. I read on, increasingly disturbed. According to Harriet, my great-great-grandfather had been a member of an esoteric society that believed in entities existing between dimensions. During a ritual, he had offered something precious in exchange for knowledge and power, a place in his bloodline, whatever that meant. The journals continued through generations, each Blackwood woman documenting the same phenomena. Shadow figures that appeared during sleep paralysis, growing more distinct and interactive with each generation. My grandmother's entries were the most detailed, describing specific entities that had followed the family for decades. A tall, thin shadow with elongated fingers, a hunched, almost feminine figure, and a smaller, child-sized shadow that made soft, weeping sounds. According to Eliza, the 3 rules had been passed down as protection. The east bedroom, originally Thomas's study where the ritual took place, was where the connection was strongest. The mirrors confused and diverted the entities, making it harder for them to manifest. And darkness was their domain. They were weakest in light. I closed the final journal, torn between rational skepticism and a creeping unease. These accounts spanned over a century, each woman describing the same entities in similar terms. Either this was an elaborate family delusion passed through generations, or I shook my head. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps a family history of sleep disorders or shared sleep paralysis hallucinations reinforced through suggestion. That night, I deliberately broke the first rule. The east bedroom had been cleaned and prepared by whoever had maintained the house after Grandma's hospitalization. It seemed perfectly ordinary, a bit colder than the rest of the house perhaps, but otherwise unremarkable. "Sorry, Grandma," I murmured as I slipped under the covers. "But it's time to put these family ghost stories to rest." I woke at 3:17 a.m., completely paralyzed. My eyes were open, but my body wouldn't respond to any commands to move. A crushing weight pressed on my chest, making each breath a struggle, and they were there, exactly as described in the journals. The tall one stood at the foot of the bed, its elongated fingers nearly touching the footboard. The hunched figure was by the window, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. And the small one, the child-sized shadow, sat on the edge of the bed near my feet. Unlike typical sleep paralysis, where hallucinations feel dreamlike, these figures had presence. They displaced the air, created cold spots where they stood, and they seemed to recognize me, their featureless faces somehow conveying familiarity. The tall one leaned forward, its head tilting at an impossible angle. Though it had no visible mouth, I heard its voice clearly in my mind. The Blackwood blood runs in your veins. The compact remains unbroken. The paralysis broke suddenly and I gasped for air, scrambling out of bed and fleeing the room. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen with every light on, clutching my grandmother's final journal. The next day, I moved my things to the master bedroom and began reading the journals more carefully. The pattern was clear. Each generation, the entities grew stronger, more present, more communicative. My grandmother had been fighting them her entire life, maintaining the protections that kept them at bay, and I had waltzed in and broken the first rule within hours of arriving. That night, despite sleeping in the master bedroom with lights on, they came again. This time the hunched figure spoke. 7 nights remain until the compact is fulfilled. The last Blackwood will open the way. Over the next days, I pieced together the full story from the journals. Thomas Blackwood's pact had offered the entities something they desperately wanted, a way into our dimension. But such a gateway required specific conditions. It needed to be opened willingly by the last of his bloodline on the 100th anniversary of the original compact. In the room where it was made, I was the last Blackwood, and according to the dates in the journals, the 100th anniversary was exactly 1 week away. I considered fleeing, but the journals suggested the entities were bound to our bloodline, not the house. Previous Blackwoods who had tried to escape had been followed, tormented until they returned. Instead, I reinforced the protections. I added more mirrors to the hallways, installed the brightest lights I could find, and sealed the east bedroom door with both physical locks and spiritual wards described in my grandmother's journals. On the 7th night, I invited Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly neighbor who had known my grandmother, to stay with me. I hadn't told her everything, just that I was nervous staying alone in the old house. She agreed readily, bringing homemade cookies and stories about Eliza. As midnight approached, the house grew unnaturally cold. The lights flickered despite the new wiring I'd installed. Mrs. Abernathy noticed my tension. "Your grandmother had difficult nights too," she said quietly, "especially toward the end." "Did she ever tell you why?" I asked. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated. She mentioned family troubles, said darkness followed the Blackwood women. She patted my hand. "I always thought she meant depression, dear. At exactly midnight, every light in the house went out simultaneously. Before I could react, the shadows appeared. Not just the 3 familiar entities, but dozens more filling the living room like smoke. The tall one approached, more solid than I'd ever seen it, almost opaque rather than shadowy. "The compact is due," it communicated. "The last Blackwood will open the way." "I won't," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "Whatever my ancestor promised, I don't consent." The shadow began to change, losing its human form, spreading outward like mist. The breathing sounds faded, replaced by a deep silence. Then gradually the darkness dissipated, thinning until it was indistinguishable from the normal shadows of the room. Mrs. Abernathy and I remained in the living room until dawn, clinging to each other in silent terror. When sunlight finally streamed through the windows, she turned to me with knowing eyes. "You've seen them too," she whispered. "The shadows." I nodded, unable to speak. "Your grandmother fought them for decades," she continued. "She thought she was protecting you by keeping you away from this place. But they were patient." "How do you know this?" I asked. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes filled with tears. "Because my grandmother made a similar compact with them. Different entities, same darkness. They've been trying to cross over for centuries, making pacts with desperate people, waiting for the right conditions." Over coffee, she explained that these shadow entities existed in a dimension parallel to ours, able to observe, but not fully manifest. They needed human gateways, willing participants with specific genetic markers. The Blackwood line had what they needed. "But you denied them," she said with wonder. "No one has ever successfully refused at the moment of fulfillment." "So it's over?" I asked hopefully. She shook her head. Not over. Delayed. They'll try again, find another approach. But you've bought time, perhaps decades. In the months since that night, I've converted the house into a research center. Mrs. Abernathy introduced me to others who've encountered these entities, and together we're documenting, comparing notes, finding patterns. The shadows still visit, occasionally, but they're weaker now, less defined. Sometimes, in sleep paralysis, the tall one watches from the corner of my room, its presence a reminder that the compact remains unfulfilled. I've learned that what Thomas Blackwood offered wasn't just access to his bloodline, but specifically to the last of his line, me. The entities need a willing Blackwood with no descendants to anchor them to our reality. So I've made my own compact of sorts. I've adopted a baby girl, giving her the Blackwood name. The shadows hate this. I can feel their rage during their increasingly rare visits. I'm no longer the last Blackwood, and the cycle can continue. I maintain my grandmother's rules, teaching them to my daughter as she grows. The mirrors stay on the walls, the lights remain on at night, and the east bedroom has been sealed permanently, its door bricked over and plastered. One day I'll pass the journals to my daughter, adding my own entries to the family legacy. Not a legacy of fear, but of resistance. Generations of Blackwood. Women standing against the darkness, keeping the shadows at bay. They are patient, but so are we. Thanks for staying with us until the very end. If you enjoyed tonight's chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that keep you up at night. Share your favorite part in the comments. We're always watching, and remember, at Nocturnal Narrative Studio, the night never truly ends.